All right, so this is our last presentation today. Dr. James from Arizona State University is going to talk to us about motivation to transfer second language learning.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for coming on this hot, humid day. I'm finding it warm, even though I'm from Arizona. I've been living there, and when I tell people I'm finding it warm here, the first thing they say is, but Arizona is a dry heat. So I guess the humidity is making it a little bit more difficult for me. So if I'm up here mopping up my brow, I apologize. Anyway, I'm an associate professor of applied linguistics at Arizona State University. And today I'm going to talk for 20 minutes about one of my recent studies. Actually, this paper is going to be in the upcoming issue of the Modern Language Journal. So if you'd like to read about it some more, you can see it in the upcoming issue. Then we'll have time for some questions. I don't have a handout, but at the end of the presentation, you'll see a website address. And if you'd like to download the slides or a recording of my presentation, I'll post it after the presentation. Okay. This study focuses on motivation, which is seen as critical to successful second language learning, and which has been the topic of a large body of scholarly work in second language education. But this study takes a unique perspective on motivation. Unlike earlier research, which has focused on motivation to learn a second language, this study focuses on motivation to transfer second language learning. This is a useful perspective because transfer is a fundamental goal of second language education. Transfer is the process by which learning in one context or with one set of materials impacts on performance in another context or with another set of materials. And transfer is important because if learning that occurs in a second language classroom does not transfer beyond that classroom, second language education has limited value. And transfer can't be taken for granted. In education circles, assumptions may be made that if learning occurs, transfer will naturally follow. But decades of research in psychology, education, and workplace training has demonstrated that promoting learning transfer can actually be very difficult. So, motivation and transfer are both important topics in second language education, and this study brings them together by looking at individuals' motivation to transfer second language learning. Since second language transfer motivation had not been defined elsewhere, I needed to create a clear definition, which I did by drawing on literature outside second language education, where some research has examined transfer motivation, as well as literature in second language education, where research hasn't examined transfer motivation, but where the extensive work that has looked at learning motivation might be helpful. Drawing on these two bodies of literature, the result was that I defined second language transfer motivation as a combination of effort, desire, and attitudes that influences whether an individual will apply second language learning from one context in a different context. So with that conceptual framework in mind, I developed a study to answer the following research questions. 1, are students motivated to transfer learning from a second language course? And 2, what factors influence this motivation? To answer these questions, I carried out a qualitative case study of a first-year English for Academic Purposes, or EAP, course at a large university in the U.S. This seemed a particularly suitable context for examining transfer motivation because besides this EAP course, these students were also taking other academic courses in various disciplines. And this meant the students were likely to have immediate opportunities to transfer learning from the EAP course. In other words, transfer, and therefore motivation to transfer, seemed particularly relevant in this second language education context. As for numbers, 40 students from 4 different sections of this EAP course participated in the study. And this slide provides some basic background information about these students. So I gathered data through semi-structured interviews near the end of the fall semester of 2007. I interviewed each of the 40 students once, and as you can see here, the set of questions covered in these interviews focused on the three main components of second language transfer motivation. In other words, the student's desire, attitudes, and effort related to learning transfer from the EAP course to their other courses. The interviews averaged 43 minutes in length, and I tape recorded them and transcribed them so I could analyze them later. Data analysis involved two main steps. To answer the first research question, I had to determine if each participant desired transfer, had favorable attitudes toward transfer, and made an effort to transfer. So I broke the interview transcripts into units of analysis that began with one of the main interview questions and included responses to that question as well as to related follow-up questions. Then I read each unit and coded it as yes if the participant's response was unconditionally positive, no if the participant's response was unconditionally negative, or mixed if the participant's response was positive and negative. For example, if the participant said sometimes or somewhat, or in some situations yes, but in other situations no, something like that. For the second research question, I identified and categorized the various reasons participants gave for why they did and why they did not desire transfer, have a favorable attitude towards transfer, and make an effort to transfer. This was an inductive process that involved reading each unit and focusing on each reason that it contained, either placing it in a category with previously read units that had similar reasons, or creating a new category. After checking the units in each category several times, I had a collection of distinct categories that encompassed all of the reasons given by these participants. To check the reliability of these analysis procedures, I asked another researcher to recode about 20% of the data. A comparison of that individual's coding decisions with the coding decisions that I had made with the same data resulted in an intercoder reliability value of about 93%. Also, about 1 month after initial coding, I recoded 20% of the interview transcripts myself, and a comparison of those coding decisions with the coding decisions that I had made 1 month earlier with the same data resulted in an intracoder reliability value of about 96%. So now we'll take a look at the findings as they relate to the two research questions. First, were these students motivated to transfer learning? The data showed that, assuming that transfer motivation is a combination of desire, favorable attitudes, and effort, few participants were truly motivated to transfer learning from the EAP course. As this table shows, in the first row, over 70% of the participants reported that to at least some degree, so I'm combining yes and mixed, to at least some degree, they desired transfer of learning from the EAP course to other courses. And in the second row, we can see that 85% of the participants reported that, to at least some degree, their attitudes toward transfer from the EAP course to other courses were favorable. But, in the bottom row, we can see that fewer than 30% of the participants said they made any kind of conscious effort to transfer learning from the EAP course to their other courses. And although we don't see it in this table, when I looked at all three components together for each of the individual students, I found that only 7 of the 40 students, or about 17%, reported that they desired and had a favorable attitude toward and made an effort to transfer learning from the EAP course to their other courses. Only 17%. As for the second research question, analysis of the data led to the generation of 8 categories of reasons the participants gave for why they were or were not motivated to transfer learning from the EAP course to other courses. Here's the list of 8 factors, and I'll describe them briefly and then show you a couple of examples to illustrate. A couple of important points about this list is, first, that it collapses reasons related to all 3 components, of transfer motivation. In other words, this list doesn't separate out the reasons students gave for desire or reasons for favorable attitudes or for effort. It puts them all together. And a second point, each of these factors is labeled in a general way so that it can include reasons that students gave for being motivated, as well as parallel reasons students gave for not being motivated. For example, if reasons students gave involved the availability of resources, as they did with the first category, the students might have explained, for example, that they were motivated to transfer because they had the time and energy to do so. Or they might have explained that they weren't motivated to transfer because they didn't have the time or energy to do so. In either case, or in both cases, I would have coded that into that first category. So with that in mind, here's a brief explanation of the categories. As I just mentioned, with the first category, motivation to transfer was linked to students' perceptions of resource availability. More specifically, the time and energy they felt they had available. With the second category, motivation to transfer was linked to students' perceptions of whether their other courses provided them with opportunities to transfer learning. That included, for example, similarities or differences the students said that they saw between the EAP course and their other courses. The third category is about perceptions of requirements. So with this category, motivation was linked to students' explanations that things they had learned in the EAP course were or were not required in other courses. The fourth category is students' beliefs about transfer. So here, motivation to transfer is linked, for example, to students' beliefs that transfer should be the outcome of learning, or that transfer should occur automatically rather than intentionally. Next, with the fifth category, motivation to transfer was linked to the impacts that participants seemed to expect transfer would have. And this included comments that transfer would or would not, quote, help in other courses. For example, help in getting higher grades. The sixth category consists of reasons related to students' own competence. For example, in this category, transfer motivation was linked to participants' reports that they had or had not learned or improved skills in the EAP course. The seventh category has to do with participants' attitudes toward learning outcomes targeted in the EAP course. So this links transfer motivation to comments students made about liking or disliking the things they were learning in the EAP course, or thinking that those things were important or not important. And finally, the eighth category has to do with participants' attitudes toward the EAP course and their other courses. This category links transfer motivation to students' comments, for example, about liking or disliking activities in the EAP course, or thinking those activities were important or not important. So just to illustrate, here are just a couple of examples. The first example is from the first category, perceptions of resource availability. And again, this category links transfer motivation to students' perceptions of the time or energy that they felt they had available. For example, in this excerpt, this student had just finished saying that she or he didn't make an effort to transfer, and when I asked why, the student explained that this lack of effort was because of a lack of time in other courses. And here's one more example. This is from the second category, which I had labeled perceptions of opportunity for transfer. As I mentioned a couple of slides ago, this category links transfer motivation to students' perceptions of whether the kind of work that they are doing in their other courses provides them with opportunities to transfer learning from the EAP course. And students talked about this in terms of the amount or type of writing that they had to do in other courses, and to similarities or differences between the EAP course and their other courses. So in this excerpt, we can see the negative impact that perceptions of opportunity for transfer can have. This participant had just finished saying that learning transfer was not that important. I asked why, and the participant said this had to do with differences between the EAP course and other courses. So to summarize, the answer to the first research question is a qualified yes. Some participants were motivated to transfer learning from the EAP course to their other courses. However, this was a relatively small proportion of the entire group. The answer to the second research question helps to explain why this was the case. The participants' second language transfer motivation was influenced both positively and negatively by a range of factors. And these factors reflect various aspects of the context, like resources and requirements, as well as various aspects of the learner, like beliefs about transfer and competence. These findings are valuable for several reasons. First, they suggest that transfer motivation cannot be assumed in second language education. In other words, it appears that being involved as a student in a second language classroom does not automatically lead to motivation to transfer second language learning beyond that classroom. Therefore, the findings in the current study help highlight an issue that is worthy of attention in second language education. Second, the factors identified in this study overlap with factors identified in transfer motivation research outside second language education. For example, researchers who have studied transfer in workplace training contexts have stressed the link between transfer motivation and learners' perceptions of competence and learners' expectations that learning will improve performance in the workplace. This overlaps with the findings in the current study that second language transfer motivation was influenced by the students' perceptions of competence and the students' expectations that transfer would or would not have an impact. In light of such overlap, research and theory on transfer motivation in other areas might be a useful source of information for future research on second language transfer motivation. And third, the factors identified in this study overlap with factors identified in research that has examined motivation to learn a second language. For example, one of the factors in this study is expected impact of transfer. And this appears similar to second language learning motivation factors like instrumentality, extrinsic motivation, expectancy. Because all these factors have to do with learners' perceptions of results or rewards related to an activity. This overlap suggests that even though motivation to learn and transfer motivation can be seen as different constructs in second language education, these constructs may be influenced by similar factors. The findings of this study also have implications for teaching practice. An argument can be made that generating motivation to transfer second language learning is an important goal in second language education. Without such motivation, students may not look for or take advantage of opportunities to use the second language outside the classroom. With this in mind, it may be of concern that second language students, like those involved in the current study, can have gaps in transfer motivation. However, if that's bad news for educators, the good news is that this study has illuminated a variety of factors that appear to influence second language transfer motivation, at least in the case of students in an EAP course. In an influential paper on second language motivation in the 1990s, Rebecca Oxford and Jill Sharon highlighted the importance of identifying factors that influence second language learning motivation when they asked this practical question. Without knowing where the roots of motivation lie, how can teachers water those roots? I think this question illustrates nicely one of the practical implications of the current study, which is helping to expose to educators the roots of students' motivation to transfer second language learning. To conclude, this study has several limitations. First, the study was conducted in only one second language education context, an EAP course for university students. So it's uncertain how broadly these findings would apply. So future research that examines transfer motivation in other contexts, for example, contexts in which students have less immediate opportunities to transfer learning, such as in foreign language education contexts, would be worthwhile. Another limitation was that for participating in the study, students were offered a bonus grade in the EAP course. So it's possible that the students who chose to participate were those who felt most in need of extra grades. And students who felt less in need of extra grades may not have been represented in the study. So future research on this topic might use a range of recruitment techniques in order to get a broader range of participants. A third limitation is that this study relied on self-report data. And with such data, it's usually difficult to know how close participants' descriptions are to their actual experiences. With this in mind, future research might involve a broader range of data sources and data collection techniques, for example, by gathering data from second language teachers and through classroom observations. And finally, this study rested on a particular definition of second language transfer motivation. In other words, as a combination of effort, desire, and favorable attitudes. However, in second language education, motivation to learn has been viewed from other angles as well. For example, self-determination theory, attribution theory, and a process model of motivation. These perspectives might also be useful in further developing ideas about second language transfer motivation. Nevertheless, despite these limitations, this study has shed some helpful light on transfer motivation in second language education, and as a result, it provides a useful foundation for further research on this topic. And with that, I'll end, and we have some time for questions.
Yes, absolutely.
You mentioned these 8 factors. Were you able to sort of scaffold them? Which one was more important or less important?
That's a good question. Yeah, I didn't go into it in this presentation, but in the full paper that I've written on this, I tried to get a sense of relative strength by reporting the frequency with which these were reported by students. It was a little tricky to go into it. It was quite detailed, but yeah. And I actually broke that down in terms of a couple of the factors were more frequent when they were given as reasons for why students didn't make an effort, and a couple of the factors were more frequent when they were given as reasons for why students did desire and have favorable attitudes, and they were different.
My next question, so would you sort of, like you mentioned, perceptions of resource availability that was both positive and negative. Did you differentiate that as well?
In this table, yeah, it blows things up into more detail than I was able to go into here. Yeah. Yeah, I really wanted to give just sort of a sense of this today, and but there's more detail about this, and I'd be happy to explain more about that. If anyone has any questions about this, please feel free to email me about it as well. I'd be happy to start a conversation about it. I think I've got my email address at the end here too.
I really look forward to reading your paper in email too.
Thank you.
I might talk a little bit about transfer learning of, say, grammar, practice, filling in the blanks, and transfer to speaking.
Right.
So I'm wondering what the learners thought about transfer, what they were thinking about when they were talking about it, like what level of language or...
Right, yeah. Like what learning outcomes from the EAP course?
Yeah,
that's a good question. Yeah. This is one paper or one study in a line of studies that I've been doing on this topic of transfer. Some of the stuff, good. and some of the other studies, I've looked at that. I've looked at that in more detail. In this case, I didn't. With this study, I really wanted to focus on motivation, and because I wasn't able to find other research that had looked at it closely in the same way that I wanted to, I wasn't able to go into too much. I wanted to save some of that because I was trying to establish a bit of a foundation here. But no, that's a great question. Yeah,
and would be thinking of grammar probably or vocabulary items.
When I've done other studies with the same population about transfer and asking, doing interviews and looking at writing samples and trying to identify the learning outcomes that actually transfer to other courses. It's a range, and it falls into categories like this EAP course focuses mainly on writing skills, and the other research that I've done has been with similar courses. And so students talk about things like skills they've developed for developing the content of their writing, for organizing their writing, and for language use, grammar, vocabulary, mechanics as well, spelling, punctuation, things like that. So it does cover quite a range. What they were talking about specifically here, I didn't tease that out.
Did you look at proficiency?
No, not in this one, no.
Do you think there would be a link between motivation to transfer and proficiency?
Well, this is where we get a sense of the connection, right? I didn't look at it beyond this. So this was an inductive process where I was trying to identify the reasons that the students gave. So the students gave me these reasons.
And coming back to what you were saying, was that a factor that was mentioned by a lot of the participants?
No,
of their competence?
this wasn't one of the common ones. It was sort of in the middle. Which ones were common? when we're talking about the reasons why they didn't make an effort, and those are the ones that I was most interested in, right? Why weren't these students making an effort? One of the ones that was common was personal beliefs about transfer, and another one was the expected impact. I think it was those two were the most common ones for reasons why they didn't make an effort. It's kind of tricky though. With I didn't want to spend in the paper. I didn't want to spend too much time on talking about the relative impact of these things because, the frequency of reports, like saying that the students talked about these two factors more than they talked about the other factors. I mean that's kind of it's a crude way of looking at relative strength. Because they may have talked about something else only one time, but it might have been a very powerful factor for them, even though they didn't talk about it as frequently. So yeah, I think that's a really important question. I'm going to try to look at other ways of getting at relative strength of factors. I don't think the way that I got at it was very satisfying.
Susie, maybe you mentioned it when you described your participants, but the students in the EAP course, were they there because of a placement test? Said, okay, you need to work on your English, or they decided to be...
Good question. They are required at this university to take a sequence of freshman composition courses, first-year writing courses, and they don't have to go into the course that is like a sheltered version of the course for second language writers. They are it's recommended that they go there based on their TOEFL scores. But they do self-place. They place themselves into that course. So they do have to take a course, but they don't necessarily have to take that course.
Well, these students were basically motivated to transfer. However, they were not making the effort to do so. Is that correct?
Depends how you define motivation. Because if you define motivation, and I was drawing on, if you're familiar with the second language learning motivation literature, I was drawing on Gardner's work, and it's been drawn on by in a significant number of other studies. So I thought that's a good base, and that definition of second language learning motivation was a combination of those three factors, right? Desire to learn, favorable attitudes toward learning, and effort to learn.
Right.
So I thought, okay, I'm just going to take those three things and then change learning to transfer, and see desire, favorable attitudes, and effort. So what happens is we see a lot of the students, the majority, are answering yes about desire and favorable attitudes, but not effort. So if we think that, and drawing again on Gardner's work, Gardner suggests, and his colleagues suggests that true second language learning motivation is a combination of all three. So if you're missing one or another, there are some gaps in your learning motivation. So using the same logic, I would say that even though a lot of students had desire and favorable attitudes, the fact that most of them weren't making an effort means that there are problems with the motivation to transfer.
I was just wondering, maybe you said it before. When it came into personal beliefs about transfer, is it because the students were actually not aware that they needed to transfer, which would have been thinking that transfer should be taught?
That's an interesting question, and I want to do a follow-up study, one of the next few studies I do, where I look at, in more focused look at beliefs about transfer among students and teachers. Because I think what's happening is, speaking for myself as an educator, I think I've had a lot of assumptions that if students learn something and demonstrate it in class, well, of course they're going to go transfer it. And I think that that's bearing out in some of the research that I'm doing, and the students probably think the same. They seem to think the same thing, because some of them are saying, well, I don't make an effort to transfer. Why should I? That should happen automatically. If I'm learning things in the EAP course, I don't have to make an effort. It should just come out. They're saying things like that.
We're done, but since it's the end of the day, we can just move on.
I'm happy to stay for a few minutes. I don't mind. Thank you.